Okay, hi everyone. So this is the first lecture in this series looking at human rights and public international law. In this first section, we look more broadly at what does public international law mean and some of the theories and understandings about that. And importantly, how we distinguish public international law from the law we mostly know, which is domestic or municipal law, state level law. Okay, so this first section is looking at what is public international law and where did it come from. So first, let's start by seeing the importance of why we're looking at public international law with human rights. And it is very important that we've got to understand, whether we're lawyers or not, we kind of need to understand what public international law is and how it works in order to better promote and protect human rights. There's a couple of reasons for that. Particularly looking at post-World War II human rights, much of the understanding and the standards and the protection of human rights comes through public international law. So human rights, as we know it, as this kind of universal manifestation of rights, really is a function of public international law. Secondly, one of the major protection mechanisms of human rights is through public international law as well, primarily through the United Nations. But one of the tools of advocacy that states that advocates and human rights defenders can use is by going to public international law and ensuring that that is enforced and protected at the state level. And lastly, it's important to understand this tension between human rights and sovereignty through the battle about public international law. Because as we know, one of the major challenges in terms of the promotion and protection of human rights is that it comes up against the state sovereign power. States say we just don't want to enforce this human right, that we do things differently in this country, and this is foreign, or this is outside us. But that's why we need to understand what public international law is and how, in some cases, there are no sovereign rights to what a state does. That states don't have sovereignty over some human rights issues. Now, this is a debate because there are some sovereign issues that states can have. There are some ways states can interpret law. But also we need to look at public international law to understand that distinction between what's sovereign and what's human rights. Okay. So next we're looking at how public international law came around, because it has a relatively recent history. It's really, as we know it today, it's probably the post-World War II phenomenon, but it may date back to maybe 100, 150 years ago. So the ideas for it, date back for millennia. But public international law as it functions and as we look at it today is a fairly recent construction or a recent invention. But that doesn't mean that it's been the same all the time. Because in history, public international law, when we're talking centuries ago, was seen to be a more realist thing, that states in power could enforce the laws as they see it. Realist here means it's much more based on ideas of power, ideas of, not based on an idealist view of what should be, based on a view that this is the powers and this is how the powers want to express that law. So that means that if you're a rich and powerful country, you decided and you enforce those laws. And the good example of this is colonialism, because we know in countries that were colonized, those colonized countries had very little rights and powers over their own legal systems or over their own political systems. And that was because the more powerful colonialist countries could enforce those laws. Now that idea of a much more realist and power-based international law has gradually changed to a much more what we call liberal or idealist or a normative system. Liberal meaning that laws are based more on ideas around freedom, so that states should have the freedom of self-determination, freedom to choose what they do. It's more idealist in the sense that the laws are there to kind of create good things, to create value and to create an order which works for everyone. That's also what normative means. Normative means that you're heading towards some goal which is good for everyone. So a normative system, as human rights as a normative system, means you're heading for a world where human rights are respected and protected, for example. Okay, so we see in history this has changed from being very realist and power-based to being much more idealist and based on values. Also in terms of the content of international law, we see it changes around a lot, from being based on ideas of customs to ideas of treaties. And we will develop this a bit further in the next section. But customs here mean that this just comes out of like a repeated history of practice. A custom like a manner, say in Thailand when people wife each other, that's a custom. And now that's and so international law was kind of like that. States just did that because everyone else did that. It wasn't written down. But nowadays, most international law is in treaties. It's written down. So that's why we see this big difference going from customary to treaty-based laws. Okay. Now, if we look actually what is public international law, public international law basically is the laws and agreements between states. So it's how states make legally binding agreements between each other in all matters, mainly matters of international issues, but it can be in any matters at all. So international law is basically the agreement between states. Now what that means is that any two states can form public international law. They can't form all the time, and not all agreements between states are public international law. But it means that there's no kind of single-centered international law. There's a whole host of different laws created by a whole lot of different countries and different international organizations. And so it means it's a lot different than what we understand as domestic law. And these differences are, firstly, there's no unified single body of laws. So in a country like Thailand, there is a unified criminal law or a unified family law. There is one single law. But internationally, laws around trade or laws around the environment vary between different regions and different countries. There's no like single body. There are some bodies of laws which are international, which all countries agree to, but there's no kind of like simple body. The same way there's no central body writing all the laws. So in a country, the government writes the laws. It's just like that single legislative body, that single law producing body. Whereas internationally, public international law can come from any country, it can come from an international organization, it can come from a regional body. There's a whole lot of different bodies that can write public international law. So it is, it has a whole lot of different places where it can be written. Another important difference is that with domestic law, we see that there's just one definition. Like a speed limit of 60 kilometers an hour is 60 kilometers an hour, that's the speed limit. But internationally, that states can modify and they can interpret international law slightly differently. For example, the full age of marriage, it could be 15, 16, 17, 18, even up to like 24 in some countries. States get to interpret and decide what the law, what the age of marriage is. And again, this is where it's different. International law can have different interpretations for the same law, whereas domestic law, there is one interpretation. Another important difference is that public international law is voluntary. Not all of it's voluntary, but most of it is. States volunteer to be part of it. They volunteer to be part of the environmental laws or human rights laws or trade laws and economic laws and so on. So it's a voluntary system. Whereas domestic law, on the whole, is not voluntary. We don't volunteer to be part of the criminal laws. We have to be part of it. Another important distinction is that international law doesn't really have a single police force. There are various ways in which international law can be enforced, but it's a lot different than domestic law where you have a police force. Now, as a kind of a way to explain this, we can think about this by looking at, say, traffic. Because if you're, say, driving down a road and you're going too fast and a policeman stops you and the policeman says, look, the speed law here, the speed limit's 60 kilometers an hour and you're going 80 kilometers an hour. That's not much you can do about that. You get a fine or whatever. You can't say, but I didn't think 80 miles an hour, 80 kilometers an hour was too fast. I thought I was going fine. The policeman just say, well, it doesn't really matter what you think. The law is the law. Now, in international law, it doesn't work like that. Okay, so we've got to understand that international law works quite differently than domestic law. So just imagine this road that you're traveling down is under international law, and each of the different cars are different states. And what that would mean is that each car would then interpret what they say is too fast. So some cars could say, well, 40 kilometers an hour, too fast. Other cars could say 80 kilometers an hour, that's too fast. Different cars can interpret the speed limit differently if it's kind of like this metaphorical international law. The next thing is, so there would be no policeman to enforce it. There's no policeman there saying, no, look, you've got to obey the speed limit. Rather, the cars themselves would in some ways police each other, or there might be regional organizations policing it. But say a car is traveling too fast, the other cars are complaining and say, hey, that's too fast, you've got to slow down. But there's no kind of police force there to stop it. And if you were stopped and you kind of made the argument, say other states stop you, made the argument, look, I was going 80 kilometers an hour, I think that's the speed that it should be. Like for me, that's not going too fast. You know, the other states would kind of have to agree. If you see that 80 is not going too fast, then that's kind of your right to interpret the law in that way. So you can see how international law works quite differently than domestic law in this sense. You know, or another important one here is voluntary. Like cars can say, well, I don't want to be part of this traffic law. I'm just going to do whatever I want. It might make the other states annoyed, but there's not much they can do about it. So you see how these laws are going to be quite different. The states themselves interpret it, the states themselves enforce it, the states themselves decide if they want to be part of it. And so it is quite a different structure. Okay, no, but even given that, there's a few kind of important contexts I need to put here. Because even though I say it's completely voluntary, that not all public international law is voluntary. There is a body of laws which we can call customary law or jus cogens law or peremptory norms, and these are not voluntary. Now, I'll come back to what these terms mean because they are slightly different. But there's a set of laws like, say, the banning of slavery and the banning of torture. States can't legalize these. No matter where or who you are, they are seen to be as against the law. You know, that if you're a state, you've got to recognize that you can't have slavery, you can't have torture, you've got to respect, say, people's religions, for example. So there is this small body of laws which states don't have the right to interpret. Now, another important fact is that international laws may be quite strong and quite widespread, like in terms of human rights. But as we've already noted a couple of times, it's very difficult to enforce. There's not very strong like an implementation of that, and there's not strong policing. So many countries, you know, agree to a whole lot of laws, but they may not implement them. And we can see this by, say, you know, Saudi Arabia agreeing to women's rights, or North Korea agreeing to civil and political rights, or even in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, countries with very poor human rights records have agreed to human rights. And so the challenge there is implementing these laws. So countries may agree to them, but they're difficult to implement. And that's then compounded further by if you don't have a police force, it's much more challenging to enforce that. Now that doesn't mean that they're not enforceable. There are ways to enforce them, but they are kind of like limited in a patchwork. So for example, some international laws are quite effective because they're based on this idea of reciprocity. Now reciprocity means that what you do to me, I'll do to you, to reciprocate. Like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. These are all kind of based on the idea of reciprocity. So trade laws and diplomatic laws and laws of war tend to be enforced through reciprocity. If I respect your troops in combat, you'll respect mine. If I respect your diplomats, you'll respect mine. And also with trade as well. So they can be enforced using reciprocity. However, human rights don't have that function of reciprocity. How a state treats its people inside the state can't be reciprocated by anyone else. That means in human rights, it tends to be other ways to enforce them. That can be, for example, the use of shaming and embarrassing state. So it's a common tool used by advocates to embarrass the state, saying, you know, you are violating these rights, which you said you were going to respect. So shaming may not be the best method of advocacy, but it's one of them. But there are actual uses of force which can occur. And these are things such as through the UN Security Council, we have sanctions or kind of military interventions, whether it's peace enforcement or peacekeeping. And even we see with senior government figures, you know, a newer tactic is arresting or having arrest warrants for these figures. And we'll come back to that as well. So there is some force that can be used. But this is more of a kind of realist way, and this only tends to be used if the powerful states either agree to it or the powerful states are not involved, that force can be used. Okay. Now, lastly, in this section, we're going to look at, just going to briefly cover some of these kind of theories and explanations of how public international law works. Now, these are kind of people's approaches to their understanding of public international law. And it's not, you don't really have to understand it that closely, but it just kind of helps to see that public international law is not interpreted the same way by everyone. People kind of understand it and interpret it differently, and there are different arguments about how public international law works. So one theory is that public international law is positivist. Now, positive here means that it exists as things, it exists as laws in writing, or it exists as action. And they say when we understand public international law, we just have to understand it as those lists of treaties and the rights in those treaties. So a positive understanding of human rights would say human rights are just what's written down in those treaties, or they're just what that country has ratified and agreed to. So if a country hasn't agreed to those human rights, then they're not rights in that country. Now, often advocates don't use this all the time because they tend to say that if we look at, say, migrant workers' rights, we should still use the Migrant Worker Convention, even though barely any countries have used it, to understand what the rights of migrant workers are. Now, pure positive would say you don't do that because the migrant workers don't have those rights and they don't exist, and so why use them? Okay, but other people would say that in a more kind of, this is the last one, more normative view of human rights would say, but this is what it should be, human rights. Migrant workers should get those rights. Now, opposed to the positive view, we have the realist view. The realist view would say laws are just the ones that are enforced, mainly by powerful states. So the public international law is actually quite weak, and not only laws that exist are those laws which the powerful states choose to enforce, and those laws which are agreed. We can only understand how public international law works by looking at what the powerful do. So all the ideals that we may have and all the wishes about how the world should be are meaningless. We should just look at how it works given the power dynamics. Okay? And this, for example, makes sense if you look at this UN Security Council and look at the ways that peace is trying to be enforced. I'd say, well, peace can only be enforced if one of the permanent 5 members, if China or Russia or England or France or who have I left out? England, France or USA choose to enforce it, then that's what makes public international law. Now, human rights tends to be seen in this last kind of theory, which is normative or idealism. Human rights are there. Human rights are like an ideal or an objective. This is how the world should work. And the public international laws are there to try and make the world work in that way. So the whole objective of law is to kind of make the world work better, make the world obey these rules. So often rules around human rights and humanitarian law and refugees and even trade laws and environmental laws are talking about this is how the world should work. People should obey these laws because it's going to be better for people. Okay, so those 3 theories are just ways of understanding. Positivist, international law is just what's written down. Realists, international law is expression of power. Or normative, international law is an objective, it's an ideal about how the world should be. Okay, so that ends the first section.